Most people believe they experience other people directly. You meet someone, observe their behavior, interpret their words, and gradually form an understanding of who they are. From the inside, this feels straightforward. It feels like perception moving outward toward another person objectively, but psychologically that is not what happens. You never experience another person in raw form. You experience a mental construction generated from fragments of information, emotional associations, memory, prediction, expectation, projection, and interpretation. The mind takes limited external signals and builds an internal version of the person that feels coherent enough to navigate socially. This construction process happens automatically because the brain cannot fully access another person's internal world directly. There is always missing information. Thoughts remain invisible. Intentions remain partially uncertain. Emotional states remain interpretive. The nervous system compensates for these gaps by predicting, filling in, and organizing social information into stable models. The result feels like knowing someone, but much of what feels known was psychologically assembled beneath awareness. This is why two people can experience the same person completely differently, while both feeling certain about who that person really is. Each mind constructed a different internal model, using different emotional histories, expectations, memories, fears, and attentional patterns. The external person may remain relatively constant, but the psychological version experienced internally changes depending on the observer. What feels like direct social perception is often the mind stabilizing uncertainty into a coherent emotional narrative that becomes psychologically real enough to treat as truth. The construction begins immediately because the brain predicts social meaning faster than conscious reasoning can evaluate it fully. Tone of voice, facial expression, posture, familiarity, attractiveness, emotional resemblance to past experiences, and subtle behavioral cues begin activating interpretations automatically within seconds. The nervous system continuously asks predictive questions beneath awareness. Is this person safe, familiar, threatening, valuable, rejecting, trustworthy? These predictions shape perception before conscious thought fully stabilizes around the interaction. Once an emotional expectation forms, attention begins organizing around confirming it. A person perceived as judgmental will have their neutral expressions interpreted differently than someone perceived as warm. The same sentence can feel comforting or threatening, depending on the predictive framework already shaping the interaction internally. This means social perception is not passive observation. It is active construction guided by emotional prediction systems operating beneath awareness. The mind then mistakes the resulting interpretation for objective insight into the other person. But much of what feels immediately obvious about someone is actually the nervous system rapidly filling uncertainty with emotionally conditioned assumptions before conscious analysis fully appears. Memory strongly influences how people are perceived because the brain continuously compares current interactions against emotionally significant past experiences. A person does not enter perception neutrally. They become psychologically associated with previous emotional patterns automatically. Someone may unconsciously remind you of a parent, former partner, authority figure, or past rejection without the resemblance being fully conscious. Once this association activates, the nervous system begins predicting familiar emotional outcomes before enough information exists to justify certainty objectively. This is one reason people can provoke unusually strong emotional reactions very quickly. The reaction often reflects not only the present interaction, but the emotional history unconsciously attached to it. The mind then experiences the emotional response as evidence about the current person, rather than recognizing how much past memory participated in shaping perception beforehand. Over time, these unconscious associations become integrated into the internal model of the person itself. The resulting version feels psychologically real because emotional memory continuously reinforces it beneath awareness. Projection intensifies this process because the mind constantly fills informational gaps using internal material it already understands. Other people are psychologically incomplete from the outside. You never fully access their motives, fears, insecurities, intentions, or internal experiences directly. The nervous system reduces this uncertainty by unconsciously projecting familiar emotional structures onto them. Desires, fears, insecurities, hopes, and expectations begin shaping what qualities appear emotionally visible in the other person. Someone craving validation may perceive rejection more easily. Someone longing for connection may perceive emotional depth that does not fully exist. Someone expecting betrayal may interpret ambiguity as threat automatically. These projections do not feel imaginary while they are happening. They feel like perception. The mind experiences the emotionally completed version of the person as if it emerged directly from external reality. This is why idealization and disappointment often occur together. The person initially experienced was partly constructed from emotional projection rather than direct understanding. Eventually, reality stops matching the projection consistently enough, and the construction begins collapsing under contradictory information. What feels like seeing the real person afterward is often just the replacement of one construction with another. The mind continuously fills social uncertainty using internal emotional material while remaining mostly unaware of how much of the perceived person was psychologically generated from within. Attention shapes relationships by determining which aspects of another person become psychologically amplified over time. No one notices everything equally. The nervous system selectively prioritizes information based on emotional relevance, fear, desire, familiarity, and expectation. This means that different observers build different emotional versions of the same individual simply because they repeatedly attend to different details. One person notices warmth, another notices inconsistency, another notices competence, another notices distance. Over time, repeated attention strengthens those selected traits until they begin dominating the internal model of the person entirely. The rest of the individual fades into the background psychologically. This creates a distorted sense of certainty, where a limited set of repeated observations becomes experienced as complete understanding. But the mind is not perceiving the full person objectively. It is stabilizing around emotionally reinforced fragments that received repeated attentional priority. The resulting internal version then feels increasingly real because repetition strengthens familiarity, and familiarity creates the sensation of truth. Eventually, the constructed version becomes emotionally automatic. The person is no longer encountered freshly in each interaction. They are encountered through the reinforced psychological framework the mind already expects to see. Language also changes how people are perceived, because labels simplify social complexity into emotionally manageable categories. Once someone is internally labeled as confident, cold, toxic, safe, intelligent, or difficult, future interactions begin passing through that conceptual filter automatically. The label becomes a predictive shortcut that shapes interpretation before conscious awareness fully evaluates new information independently. Contradictory behaviors receive less attention because the mind prioritizes coherence. Supporting evidence becomes emotionally amplified while inconsistent details fade into the background. This creates increasingly stable internal constructions that feel self-confirming over time. The actual person remains dynamic and internally complex, but the psychological version becomes simplified into patterns the nervous system can predict efficiently. The mind then mistakes predictive consistency for genuine understanding. In reality, the conceptual framework itself has narrowed perception enough that the person is now being experienced through a stabilized psychological model rather than through open-ended observation. Emotional need distorts social perception even further because people often experience others partly in relation to what they psychologically require from them. Loneliness changes perception. Insecurity changes perception. Desire changes perception. Fear changes perception. The mind unconsciously searches for emotional regulation through relationships, and this alters how people are interpreted before conscious reasoning fully recognizes the distortion. Someone, emotionally deprived, may perceive ordinary attention as deep connection. Someone afraid of abandonment may perceive distance where none exists. Someone seeking safety may overlook harmful behavior because the emotional need for stability outweighs contradictory signals. These distortions rarely feel intentional. They feel emotionally true because the nervous system is organizing social perception around unmet psychological needs operating beneath awareness. The resulting construction becomes emotionally convincing precisely because it helps stabilize internal tension temporarily. But the stabilization often depends more on the internal need than on the external person objectively. This is why relationships can sometimes feel emotionally transformative long before genuine understanding between two people actually develops. Social identity also influences perception because people unconsciously organize others into categories related to belonging, familiarity, status, and threat automatically. The nervous system evolved to simplify social environments quickly because rapidly assessing alliances, intentions, and group dynamics increased predictability. As a result, perception begins organizing people into emotionally meaningful structures before conscious awareness fully reflects on them. Accent, appearance, confidence level, social role, emotional tone, and behavioral familiarity all trigger associations shaped by culture, memory, upbringing, and repeated exposure. Once these associations activate, interpretation begins narrowing automatically. The person is no longer experienced neutrally. They are experienced through emotionally conditioned frameworks the mind already recognizes. This is one reason first impressions feel unusually powerful. The nervous system forms emotionally weighted predictive models extremely quickly because uncertainty itself creates tension. The model then stabilizes perception by reducing ambiguity. But reducing ambiguity often means replacing complexity with assumption. The resulting version of the person feels psychologically coherent while remaining heavily filtered through prior conditioning operating beneath awareness. The illusion becomes strongest because the mind hides the construction process itself. You do not consciously observe prediction filling gaps, projection organizing uncertainty, emotional need distorting interpretation, or memory attaching past patterns to present interactions while these processes are occurring. You experience only the final emotional impression once the nervous system has stabilized around a coherent social model. The resulting perception feels immediate and obvious, creating the sensation that you are simply seeing who someone is. But the certainty comes partly from the mind, reducing social uncertainty internally, rather than from direct objective access to another person's inner reality. This is why misunderstandings can persist even between people who spend years together. Each person is interacting not only with the external individual, but with the internal construction continuously reinforced beneath awareness. The relationship then becomes partly shaped by how each nervous system predicts, filters, and emotionally organizes the other person internally over time. The deeper realization is not that people are fake or unknowable. It is that social perception is always partially constructed because consciousness cannot access another person directly without interpretation. The mind must predict, simplify, project, emotionally weight, categorize, and stabilize incomplete information in order to create a usable social reality. Without construction, relationships would feel overwhelmingly uncertain and psychologically unstable. But once the construction becomes visible, certainty changes. Emotional reactions still occur. Attraction still feels immediate. Judgments still form automatically, but they stop feeling completely transparent. You begin recognizing that every person you know exists partly as an internal psychological version shaped by your memory, attention, emotional needs, predictions, and conditioning operating beneath awareness. And once that becomes visible, relationships stop feeling like direct contact between two objective selves. They begin feeling like interactions between constructed internal worlds trying to interpret one another in real time. Repetition strengthens these internal versions until they begin replacing fresh perception almost entirely. The more consistently the mind interprets someone through the same emotional framework, the more automatic that framework becomes. Eventually, interactions stop being processed primarily in the present moment. They begin passing through accumulated expectation first. A person repeatedly experienced as disappointing will begin triggering disappointment before they fully act. A person repeatedly experienced as comforting will begin triggering emotional safety before anything objectively reassuring happens. The nervous system predicts the emotional meaning of the interaction in advance because repeated patterns increase predictive certainty. Over time, the prediction itself becomes psychologically dominant. This is why long-term relationships often become emotionally rigid. People stop encountering each other openly and begin encountering reinforced internal models stabilized through years of repeated interpretation. The external person may continue changing, but the internal version often changes much more slowly because the nervous system prioritizes continuity over constant reevaluation. Familiar perception becomes emotionally efficient. The mind then mistakes efficiency for accuracy. What feels like knowing someone deeply may partly reflect how completely the brain has stabilized its internal construction of them through repetition. And once that stabilization becomes strong enough, contradictory information can struggle to penetrate the existing emotional framework because the system already believes it understands who the person is. The shift begins when you recognize that perception inside relationships is never completely neutral. Every interaction passes through memory, emotion, prediction, attention, identity, fear, desire, and learned social conditioning before it becomes conscious experience. This does not make relationships meaningless. In many ways, it makes them more psychologically revealing. The version of someone your mind constructs often says as much about your internal world as it does about the other person themselves. What you amplify, fear, idealize, distrust, or emotionally depend on inside others reflects the structures already active within your own nervous system. Once this becomes visible, relationships stop feeling like simple observation and begin feeling like ongoing acts of interpretation, shaped by two constructed realities interacting simultaneously. The goal is not to eliminate projection or interpretation completely, because social perception depends on prediction to function. The goal is to notice how much of what feels emotionally obvious about another person was assembled internally before certainty fully formed around it. And once that awareness develops, people stop appearing as fixed emotional conclusions. They begin appearing as infinitely more complex than the mind's first stable construction of them ever allowed them to be.